Now, I'm not that old, allegedly, but I'm old enough to remember the 2008 financial crisis, when the world was sent into a complete tailspin and the global economy looked as though it was on the brink of collapse, as in slowest recovery in history, consistently poor economic growth. We're going to be looking at some of the causes, why the UK was hit so hard, and what these two ghouls had to do with it. But this is where we get into it. I mean, these two clowns will be out of their depth in a puddle, so we're about to do to the UK economy what Limp Bizkit did to music in the 1990s. The first thing is an over-reliance on financial services. London has long held the crown, bit of a wobble recently, but traditionally speaking it's been the global centre of finance all over the world. One of the reasons why there are more investment banks in London than in New York is because of its location. Banks that are based in London are also able to trade with Asia as well as the US. And for the 80s, 90s and into the early 2000s, this served the UK really well. They brought in high tax receipts, they provided good, high-paying jobs, and were one of the real boons to the City of London. But it was exactly this over-reliance, this overindulgence for big banks, which meant that the UK was disproportionately affected when the financial crisis eventually hit. We had built an economy that was extremely reliant on credit, and so when that credit completely froze, it meant that the rest of the economy froze. When credit markets get frozen, it just sends shockwaves throughout the whole economy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is geographical inequality. As we mentioned, London for a long time was effectively seen as kind of the powerhouse of the rest of the UK. Lord knows it funds a lot of the kind of expensive property that sits in the southeast and all around the home counties in the UK. But what this really meant is that you have this extreme reliance on a particular part of the UK, and so if that freezes up, it trickles down through the rest of the UK geographically. Low productivity growth. One of the things we talked about in the first video is that UK productivity growth has basically completely flatlined. Lots of companies were trying to reduce their leverage, they were trying to reduce their debt burden, and so that meant they weren't spending money on their productive capacity. And this lower productivity growth ultimately means that the UK became less competitive globally, and this lack of productivity growth also meant that wage growth was virtually non-existent for years. Housing costs. So let's just imagine the scenario. You've bought your house in the mid-early 2000s, but then the arse falls out of the global economy basically because of mortgages. And comment down below if you want a full explainer of how the financial crisis unfolded. But now you're in a situation where your wages aren't growing very much because your company isn't investing, where the price of your house has dropped kind of precipitously, and the interest that you're going to have to pay on your debt increases. So what this really means is that you've got this three-pronged attack on people's disposable income, and very much like the cost of living crisis that we're going through now, it means that people just didn't have money in their pockets to be able to spend on the things that they would want to, and in order to keep the economy moving, public debt. So the problem here is twofold. The first is that tax receipts started to decrease, but it's also just spent a load of money. You've got millions of people out of work, which means that you've got fewer tax receipts coming in, but you're also paying out benefits to people, rightly so. And you've also just had to spend a load of money bailing out big banks, financial institutions, and so the government's books were kind of completely upside down. But this is where we get into it. I mean, these two clowns will be out of their depth in a puddle, so let's get into it. And the last thing is poor policy. But there are basically three key players that you have in an economy. You have the government, you have private business, and you have households. We'll just assume that the economy is somewhat closed for the purposes of this analogy, but obviously in the real world it doesn't quite play out like this. So let's say I go out and buy a car. That car has to be manufactured. All of those components have to be brought around. They are transported through roads that the government has built. I will have to pay VAT on that car, which goes to the government. The government will then use that money to employ so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And I want to show you this video. This is from a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Paul Krugman.
If you try to have a situation in which everyone is trying to slash at the same time, which the private sector is trying to slash spending because it feels it has too much debt, and in which then the government is also saying, well, we have too much debt, so we're all trying to slash, then we run up against the fundamental fact that we are not a household, we are an economy, and that your spending is my income, and my spending is your income.
As Paul Krugman puts it, my spending is your income, and your spending is my income. So if these three players are all connected to one another, but the problem is, if everyone's going through this deleveraging process, then where's the growth going to come from? Now, you could make a Keynesian argument here that that's the point at which the government should have done the opposite. They should have turned the tap on big time. Big infrastructure projects, they should have been really funding, build loads of schools, build loads of hospitals, give people loads of jobs, and that's where the growth comes from. And then as the private sector and as private households start to get on a more secure financial footing, you gradually taper off that spending, you gradually increase taxes, and you use that money to reduce your national debt. But the problem was that wasn't the thinking at the time, and I think at this point there's a decent amount of evidence that actually cutting public services and cutting public spending as much as they did at the time basically just meant that it prolonged the kind of economic agony, and the UK economy just didn't recover as quickly as it did. Look at him carrying that thing like he's carrying the Ark of the fucking Covenant. And I think when all is said and done, all right-thinking people would acknowledge that the policy was mistimed and mishandled. So, in conclusion, I think we should separate this out into two pieces. The first is, one of the reasons why the UK was hit so hard was a mistake that was decades in the making. It was deregulation of the financial services industry, it was the over-reliance on the financial services, but then after the financial crisis, there were some shorter-term decisions that were made, like cutting public spending, that just exacerbated it and has really meant that the UK has never really recovered from that. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to watch the previous videos in this series where we talked about the weakness of the UK economy and some of the policy objectives which could really help to alleviate some of these problems that we've talked about, then make sure you check out these videos just here. Thanks very much for watching. Peace.